The USS Ironclad was not a remarkable ship. It was a mid-class patrol frigate with patched-up hull plating, an engine that groaned every time it jumped to faster-than-light speed, and a crew of just over 200 men and women who had long accepted that they were not stationed on the pride of the fleet. They were border patrol. They watched empty space and filed reports that nobody read. Captain Danny Cole liked it that way, and he was a quiet man from a small town in Ohio who had joined the fleet because he believed in service, not glory. He kept his uniform neat, his voice calm, and his expectations reasonable. He did not shout orders. He asked for them to be carried out, and somehow that was enough. His crew respected him not because he demanded it, but because he had never once asked them to do something he would not do himself. His first officer was Lieutenant Commander Katie Moore, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue who had turned down a posting on a bigger ship twice because she said she preferred working with people who actually needed her. She ran the day-to-day operations of the Ironclad with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of someone who had long ago accepted that the universe was deeply unfair but still worth trying to fix. The third piece of the puzzle was Chief Engineer Pete Harris, a man who spoke to the ship's engines the way some people spoke to old dogs, with affection, frustration, and a constant low-level worry that something vital was about to give out. Pete could fix anything with enough time and enough wire, and he had kept the Ironclad running years past the point where any reasonable engineer would have recommended retirement. These three, along with their crew, drifted through the outer edge of human-controlled space on a Tuesday morning that felt like every other Tuesday morning. Nothing on the sensors, nothing on the communication channels, just the soft hum of the ship and the slow crawl of stars outside the viewports. Humanity in the wider galaxy was not important. That was the simple truth of it. 40 years earlier, human beings had made first contact, and in the time since, as they had been granted a seat on the Galactic Concord, the governing body of known civilized space. But a seat did not mean a voice. Humans were young. Their civilization was barely a blink in the timeline of species that had been traveling between stars for tens of thousands of years. The elder races tolerated humanity the way a group of old professors might tolerate a child who had wandered into a lecture hall. Polite smiles, gentle nods, complete disregard the moment the child turned away. The dominant power in the region was the Velarath Dominion, an ancient reptilian empire that had ruled its sector for over 9,000 years. The Velarath were tall, cold, and efficient. They did not hate humans. Hatred would have required them to consider humans worthy of an emotional response. They simply looked past them, the way a person might look past an insect on a windowsill. Danny was reviewing supply logs in his small office when the distress signal came through, and it was broken and full of static, cutting in and out like a voice trying to scream through a storm. The signal came from Elkridge 7, a small human mining colony on the frontier. Danny had never been there, but he knew the name. It was a settlement of about 300 people. Miners, engineers, a few families who had followed them out to the edge of nowhere looking for a fresh start. Katie brought the signal to him and played it on the speaker in his office. They heard fragments. A woman's voice, the words ships and coming down, and then a sound that might have been an explosion or might have been the signal dying. Then nothing. Danny looked at the star chart. Elkridge 7 was outside his patrol zone. Going there would mean leaving his assigned route, burning fuel they could not easily replace, and potentially arriving at a situation they were not equipped to handle. Katie laid out these facts calmly and clearly. Pete, would probably hold for the trip. Probably. Danny gave the order to change course. When the Ironclad dropped out of faster-than-light travel above Elkridge 7, the bridge went silent. Below them, on the surface of a dusty brown world that should have held a small but living community, there was nothing. The colony was gone, not abandoned, destroyed, and they could see the scorch marks from orbit, long black streaks across the ground where buildings had stood, Landing pads were cracked and melted. Storage units were ripped open like tin cans. Danny sent a team to the surface. They found no bodies, no survivors, just ash, twisted metal, and silence. 312 people had lived on Elkridge 7, and every single one of them had vanished. In the wreckage of what had been a small schoolhouse, they found a personal data pad belonging to a woman named Megan Price. She had been the colony's teacher. Her log entries painted a picture of a quiet life. Lesson plans, notes about students who were struggling with math, a reminder to order more books from the supply ship. The last entry was different. It was short and shaking. She wrote that massive ships had come down through the clouds. She wrote that armored figures were pulling people out of shelters. To Earth Command through the official channels. The response came back 6 hours later. It was polite, formal, and useless. He was told to hold position, document the scene, and await further instructions. Someone would look into it. A committee would review the matter. There were procedures. Katie found him on the bridge afterward, standing in front of the main view screen with his hands behind his back, looking down at the burned surface of Elkridge 7. She had known him for 4 years. She had seen him tired, frustrated, and once mildly amused by a joke Pete told about a broken fuel injector. She had never seen him angry. She saw it now. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a stillness that settled over him like frost, quiet and deep and very, very cold. He said, almost to himself, that someone was going to answer for this. 2 days later, a Velarath diplomatic envoy appeared on the Galactic Concord communication network and addressed the matter of Elkridge 7 with board efficiency. The envoy stated that the colony had been established on unclaimed frontier territory that fell within the Velarath sphere of influence. Any incident that may have occurred was an internal matter. The Concord had no jurisdiction. In the Great Hall of the Concord Station, the human ambassador, a woman named Lisa Grant, stood at her podium and looked around the chamber. She looked at the Torvan mediators, tall and ancient, who studied her with their many eyes and said nothing. She looked at the Drenari philosophers, who glowed faintly with what might have been sympathy but offered no words. She looked at species after species, race after race, and not one of them met her gaze. Lisa stood alone in that enormous room, and the silence told her everything she needed to know. Lisa Grant had been a diplomat for 23 years. She had learned early in her career that patience was not just a virtue, but a weapon. She had sat through negotiations that lasted weeks. She had smiled at people who insulted her to her face, and had found ways to turn their words back on them without ever raising her voice. She was good at her job, and she believed in the system. That belief was starting to crack. She stood before the full assembly of the Galactic Concord for the 3rd time in 10 days and presented her evidence. Satellite imagery showing Velarath warships in orbit above Elkridge 7 during the time of the attack. Debris analysis confirming weapon signatures that matched Velarath military-grade plasma cannons. Communication intercepts that placed Velarath naval units in the area. She laid it all out, piece by piece, in clear and measured language, the way she had been trained to do. The Torvan mediator, a towering insectoid figure with dozens of small dark eyes arranged across a wide, flat head, listened to every word. When Lisa finished, the mediator folded its long, segmented arms and thanked her for what it called her impassioned presentation. Then it suggested, in a tone that was perfectly polite and perfectly empty, that humans may have misread the situation. Frontier space was dangerous. Many things could happen on the edge of civilized territory. Perhaps the colony had been struck by raiders. Perhaps there had been an accident. Perhaps the humans had simply not understood what they were looking at. Lisa asked, as calmly as she could, what kind of accident left plasma burns in a pattern consistent with orbital bombardment. The mediator did not answer. It moved to the next item on the agenda. The Drenari representative, a being made of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light, approached Lisa after the session, and it expressed what it called deep sympathy for humanity's loss. It said that the Drenari understood suffering and that they grieved with the human people. Then it said that direct confrontation with the Velarath would be unwise. The Dominion was powerful. A war would cause far more suffering than it would prevent. Patience, the Drenari said, was the path to resolution. Lisa thanked the Drenari for its kind words and walked back to her quarters. And she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her hands for a long time. Then she picked up her private communication device and called Earth. Admiral Joe Brennan answered from his office at Fleet Headquarters. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had spent his life carrying heavy things, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of rough stone and then left in the rain for a few decades. Then he had commanded Earth's defense fleet during a border skirmish with pirates 10 years earlier, a small, ugly fight that nobody remembered except the people who had been in it. He listened to Lisa's report without interrupting. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long time. Joe told her he understood. He told her he was working on something. He asked her to keep doing what she was doing, even though they both knew it was not working. And because it mattered that the record showed humanity had tried every peaceful option first. Lisa asked him what happened after peaceful options ran out. Joe said he would let her know. Meanwhile, out on the frontier, Danny Cole and his crew had not been sitting still. The official order was to hold position and wait. Danny held position. He also put every spare hand on the ship to work analyzing the data they had collected from Elkridge 7. Katie Moore led the effort. She was not a trained intelligence analyst, but she was methodical, stubborn, and very good at finding patterns in things that other people overlooked. She pulled communication intercepts from unsecured Velarath shipping channels, not military channels, which were heavily encrypted, but commercial ones, which were sloppy. She cross-referenced shipping routes, cargo manifests, and energy signatures. Slowly, a picture began to form. The Velarath had not just hit Elkridge 7. Over the past decade, the colonies belonging to multiple minor species had disappeared along the frontier, small settlements, unimportant places that nobody powerful cared about. The Velarath had been careful. They only took from species that did not have the strength to fight back and did not have the political standing to make anyone else fight for them. Danny made contact with a Selthari trader at a refueling station near the border. The Selthari were a small, quiet, mammalian species with silver-colored eyes and soft voices. 2 centuries ago, the Velarath had nearly wiped them out during an expansion campaign. The surviving Selthari had scattered across the galaxy, living as traders and drifters, too few and too weak to ever challenge the Dominion. The trader confirmed what Katie had found. Dozens of colonies from minor species had vanished over the years. Everyone who paid attention knew the Velarath were responsible. Nobody with the power to stop it cared enough to act. The trader looked at Danny with those silver eyes and said something that stayed with him. The trader said that in the galaxy, being right did not matter. Only being strong mattered. And if you were not strong, then being right just meant you suffered with a clear conscience. Danny thanked the trader and returned to his ship. It was Pete Harris who found the last piece. Digging through the chemical analysis of debris from Elkridge 7, so he identified a compound mixed in with the weapon residue. It was not a byproduct of plasma fire. It was a sedative, a specific chemical cocktail used in biological laboratories to keep living subjects unconscious during procedures. Pete had recognized it because he had studied xenobiology as a hobby for years, a fact that surprised everyone on the ship except Katie, who said it explained why he talked to the engines like they were alive. And the Velarath had not destroyed Elkridge 7 to claim territory. They had not taken the colonists as slaves, or at least not only as slaves, They were experimenting on them. 312 human beings, including Megan Price and the children she had taught, were in a Velarath laboratory somewhere, and things were being done to them that Pete could not bring himself to describe in detail in his report. Danny read Pete's findings in the engine room, leaning against a bulkhead while Pete sat on an overturned crate and waited. When Danny finished reading, he handed the datapad back to Pete and asked him to encrypt the file at the highest level their systems could manage. Then he went to his office and opened a private, encrypted channel, not to Earth Command with its committees and procedures, but directly to Admiral Joe Brennan. He sent everything: the shipping data, the pattern of raids, the chemical analysis, all of it. Now, Brennan received the transmission at 2 in the morning, Earth time. He read it in his kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee that went cold in his hand. When he finished, he made 3 calls. The first was to Commander Chris Lawson, a tactical specialist who had written papers on asymmetric warfare that most of the fleet considered brilliant and slightly insane. The second was to Captain Amy Dalton, who commanded the heavy cruiser USS Defiant, and who had a reputation for being the kind of officer who, once pointed at a problem, did not stop until the problem no longer existed. The third call was to a supply depot, where he quietly began redirecting fuel and ammunition to a staging point that did not officially exist. Back on the Ironclad, Pete finally cracked a piece of encrypted Velarath military communication that had been buried in the data from Elkridge 7. It was not a full message. It was a fragment, a single line from a report that had been partially deleted but not completely erased. Katie cleaned up the text. Danny read it aloud on the bridge, and the words settled over the crew like a weight. The human specimens are performing beyond all projected thresholds. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Katie stared at her console. Pete rubbed his face with both hands. Danny stood very still, looking at the words on the screen. And the cold thing that had settled in his chest when he first saw the ruins of Elkridge 7 grew a little deeper and a little harder. He turned to Katie and asked her to plot every known Velarath research facility within 3 sectors. She did not ask why. She just started working. High Commander Zorvan stood before the ruling council of the Velarath Dominion in the Great Stone Hall on their home world and delivered his report with the calm efficiency that his species prized above all things. For 40 minutes. He did not waste for 40 minutes. He did not waste a single word. The human specimens, he explained, were extraordinary. Not in the way the Velarath usually meant when they used that word. The humans were not stronger than other species. They were not faster. Their senses were average at best. Their bodies were soft, fragile things that broke easily under pressure. By every standard metric of biological capability, humans were unremarkable. But they did something that no other species in the Velarath research program had ever done. They refused to stop. Zorvan presented the data. When subjected to physical stress, human bodies produced a chemical response. Adrenaline, the humans called it, that temporarily increased their strength, speed, and pain tolerance far beyond what their baseline biology should have allowed. Other species had similar responses, but in most cases those responses triggered a shutdown. The body would fight, and then it would collapse. Humans did not collapse. They kept going. Their systems adapted. Their immune responses learned from injuries and became more efficient. Their minds, remarkably, continued to function even under extreme duress. They made decisions, they solved problems, and they cooperated with each other in ways that the Velarath researchers found difficult to predict or model. One researcher had noted in his report that a group of human captives, when placed in a stressful environment with limited resources, had not turned on each other as every behavioral model predicted they would. Instead, they had organized. They had shared food. They had protected their weakest members. They had, against all logic, and a voice like grinding stone asked Zorvan if the humans posed any threat to the program. Zorvan said no. The humans were contained. Their homeworld was weak. Their fleet was small and outdated. The wider galaxy considered them insignificant. There was no risk. But the Council granted Zorvan additional resources and told him to continue his work. Zorvan returned to his research station orbiting the barren moon of Kreeth 4 and resumed his experiments. He was a scientist. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. Cruelty required emotion, and the Velarath considered emotion a primitive trait. He simply did not consider the suffering of lesser species to be a relevant factor in his calculations. The humans in his facility were subjects. Their pain was data. Their resilience was a puzzle to be solved. He did not think about them as people. That was his first mistake. Far from Kreeth 4, on the other side of Velarath space, Danny Cole sat in his captain's chair aboard the Ironclad and waited. He had sent everything to Admiral Brennan. He had been told to trust the Admiral and hold his position. So he held it. But holding still was not the same as doing nothing. Katie had mapped every known Velarath research facility within 3 sectors. There were 7. Cross-referencing the shipping data and energy signatures, she had narrowed down the most likely location of the captured colonists to a facility in the Kreeth system. The evidence was not perfect. It was not the kind of proof that would hold up in a conquered tribunal, but it was enough. Danny shared the information with his crew. He did not sugarcoat it. He told them what the Velarath were doing to the people from Elkridge 7. He told them that the galaxy was not going to help. He told them that Earth was putting together a response, but that the Ironclad might be called upon to play a part, and that the part they played might be dangerous. A young sensor operator named Ben Torres, who was 22 years old and had joined the fleet because it was the only way he could afford a college education, raised his hand and asked what kind of dangerous. Danny told him honestly that he did not know yet. Ben nodded and went back to his station. Nobody asked to leave. Nobody filed a transfer request. Katie told Danny later that she was not surprised. She said that the kind of people who ended up on a ship like the Ironclad were the kind of people who did not run away from things, mostly because they had never been important enough for anyone to run toward them, and they understood what it felt like to be forgotten. On the Concord station, Lisa Grant made one final attempt. She requested an emergency session of the full assembly. She was granted 15 minutes. She used every second. She stood at her podium, and she did not present data this time. She did not show charts or play intercepted communications. Instead, she read names. She read the names of every person who had been taken from Elkridge 7. She read them slowly, one by one, and she told the assembly something about each of them. She told them about Megan Price, who had taught school on a frontier world because she believed every child deserved an education, no matter how far from Earth they lived. She told them about a miner named Sam Kowalski, who had coached a little league team on the colony. She told them about a 6-year-old girl named Lily who had drawn pictures of alien animals she hoped to see one day. The chamber was silent. 312 names. Lisa read every single one. When she finished, the Torvan mediator thanked her and said the matter would be tabled for further review at a future session. Lisa gathered her files. She walked out of the chamber. She did not cry. She did not shout. She walked to her quarters, sat down at her desk, and opened a secure channel to Admiral Brennan. She said 5 words. "They are not going to help." Brennan was ready. He had been ready for days. But the task force was assembled at the unofficial staging point. 12 ships, led by the USS Defiant, under Captain Amy Dalton. Commander Chris Lawson had spent 72 hours without sleep, developing a tactical plan built on one simple insight. The Velarath were predictable. 9,000 years of dominance had made them rigid. Their fleets fought in strict hierarchical formations. Every ship knew its place. Every officer followed the chain of command without deviation. It was efficient. It was disciplined. And it meant that if you broke the chain, If you took out the command ships, the rest of the fleet would hesitate. Not for long. The Velarath were not cowards, but they would hesitate, because independent decision-making was not something they trained for. It was something they trained against. Humans, Chris explained to the fleet commanders in his briefing, were the opposite. Every officer in the human fleet was trained to think for themselves. Every crew member was encouraged to adapt, improvise, and act on their own judgment when the situation demanded it. It was messy. It was chaotic. And against an enemy that relied on order, it was going to be the one advantage they had. Amy Dalton stood in front of her crew on the Defiant before they departed. She was not a tall woman. She was not physically imposing. She had a round face, steady brown eyes, and a voice that carried without effort. She did not give a rousing speech. She told them where they were going and what they would face. She told them the Velarath outnumbered them. She told them that the ships they were flying were good but not invincible. She told them that people were counting on them. People who had been taken from their homes and were being hurt in ways that no living thing should ever be hurt. Then she said something that every person on that ship remembered for the rest of their lives. She said she was scared. And she said that anyone who was not scared was not paying attention. And then she said that she was going anyway, because some things mattered more than being afraid. Not one person left their post. The fleet departed. 12 ships. Danny and the Ironclad joined as a scout element. Katie formally noted her objection in the ship's log, pointing out that the Ironclad was a patrol frigate, not a warship, and that taking it into combat against the Velarath Dominion was, in her professional opinion, completely insane. Danny acknowledged her objection. Pete said the engines would hold, probably. 12 human ships crossed into Velarath-controlled space on a quiet night, moving fast and running silent. The Galaxy did not notice. The Concorde did not notice. The Velarath, in their ancient certainty that no minor species would ever dare challenge them, did not notice. That was their second mistake. The Velarath research station orbiting Creeth 4 was a massive structure, a dark, angular thing that looked like it had been carved from a single block of black iron and hung in space above a lifeless gray moon. Long-range scans from the Ironclad revealed 40 Velarath warships arranged in a standard defensive pattern around the station. Cruisers on the outer ring, destroyers in the middle, the command ships tucked safely behind the formation, close to the station itself. 40 warships against 12. The math was not complicated. It was terrible. Chris Lawson had planned for terrible math. He had never expected to win by force. He expected to win by being unpredictable, and the first step of being unpredictable was doing something that no rational military commander would ever do. He told Danny to take the Ironclad ahead of the fleet, alone, and make a lot of noise. Danny did not hesitate. He brought the Ironclad out of silent running and began broadcasting a distress signal on a civilian merchant frequency. And the signal was panicked and sloppy, exactly the kind of transmission a lost cargo ship might send if its engines were failing near hostile territory. Katie, sitting at the communications console, fed Danny lines that grew increasingly frantic. She had a talent for creative desperation. Pete contributed by triggering a controlled engine flare, a burst of energy from the rear of the ship that, on any sensor screen, looked exactly like a vessel about to blow apart. The Velarath responded the way Chris had predicted they would. They sent a detachment, 8 warships, to investigate the signal. It was standard procedure. A dying merchant ship was not a threat, but it was a potential intelligence opportunity. The Velarath were thorough. They did not ignore things. 8 ships pulled away from the defensive formation. The gap they left was small, but it was there. Amy Dalton did not wait for an invitation. And the moment those 8 ships cleared the formation, she brought the remaining 11 human ships out of hiding in a hard burn directly at the station. The engines of the Defiant roared. The smaller frigates and destroyers flanked her on both sides, running at full speed toward a wall of Velarath warships that outgunned them in every measurable way. The Velarath fleet responded instantly, and the remaining 32 ships formed a defensive wall, a rigid line of overlapping fire zones arranged by rank and class, with the heaviest ships in the center and lighter ships on the edges. It was a textbook formation. It had worked against every enemy the Velarath had faced for thousands of years. Chris had studied that textbook. He had read it so many times he could recite it from memory, and he had found the flaw. The human fleet did not hit the wall head-on, at the last moment, and they split into 3 groups. Amy took the Defiant and 4 ships hard to the left. A second group of 3 ships broke right. The third group, just 3 ships, dove underneath the formation entirely. All 3 groups targeted the same thing, the command ships at the rear. The Velarath wall was designed to face a single threat from a single direction. When 3 threats came from 3 directions at once, the formation held, but the ships on the edges had to choose which group to track, and that choice took time. For rigid, hierarchical officers who were trained to wait for orders before adapting, even a few seconds of uncertainty was enough. The battle began, and it was brutal from the first second. 2 human ships, the frigates Carson and Ridley, were destroyed in the opening exchange. They flew straight into concentrated Velarath fire while the other groups maneuvered, and they were torn apart in less than a minute. A third ship, the destroyer Hale, I took a direct hit to its engine section and went dark, spinning slowly away from the fight with half its crew dead. But the 3-pronged attack worked. The group that had gone underneath the formation came up behind the Velarath line and hit the first command ship with everything they had. Plasma fire, kinetic rounds, and 2 torpedoes struck the command cruiser almost simultaneously. Its shields held for 4 seconds. Then they failed. The ship broke apart in a flash of white light, and the Velarath fleet hesitated. 11 seconds. Chris had estimated 10. For 11 seconds, the ships nearest the destroyed command cruiser stopped firing, stopped maneuvering, and waited for new orders from the next ship in the chain of command. 11 seconds in which their weapons were silent and their formations drifted. Amy Dalton used every one of those seconds. The Defiant punched through the weakened left side of the formation and fired on the second command ship at close range. But the blast did not destroy it, but it crippled its communication array, which was almost as good. A command ship that could not command was just a large target. The battle became chaos after that, and chaos was where humans lived. Velarath officers shouted for order. They tried to reform their lines, re-establish their chain of command, pull their ships back into proper positions. But the human ships would not stay still. They darted between the larger Velarath cruisers. I changed direction without warning, targeted different systems on different ships. Engines here, sensors there, weapons on another. No 2 human ships fought the same way. No pattern repeated. The Velarath could not predict them, because there was nothing to predict. Each human crew was making decisions on their own, reacting to what was in front of them, adapting in real time. On the station, alarms screamed through every corridor. High Commander Zorvan watched the battle from the command center and felt something he had not felt in decades: uncertainty. He ordered the human captives moved to a secure level deep inside the station. He began transferring his research data to backup storage. He was not panicking. Velarath did not panic. He had sent a signal to the Dominion fleet the moment the attack began. Reinforcements were coming. He simply needed to hold. Amy Dalton did not intend to give him that time. While the space battle raged outside, she led a boarding team through a docking port that the Defiant had blown open with a precision torpedo strike. 30 Marines in heavy armor, moving through the dark corridors of a Velarath station that had never been designed to repel boarders because no one had ever been foolish enough to try. The fighting inside was close and vicious. Velarath soldiers were bigger than humans. Their scales acted as natural armor. and their claws could tear through a standard combat suit. In a straight fight, one-on-one, a Velarath soldier would beat a human soldier almost every time. The humans did not fight straight. They moved in pairs and groups, covering every angle, communicating constantly through short, clipped words and hand signals. When one Marine fell, another stepped into the gap before the Velarath could exploit it. When a corridor was too well defended, they found another way around. And they adapted so fast that the Velarath defenders could not keep up. A young corporal named Nick Ortega found himself alone in a narrow corridor when a Velarath counterattack cut him off from his squad. Behind him were 3 medics treating wounded Marines. The Velarath came down the corridor, 4 soldiers armored and armed. Nick's rifle had been damaged in the fighting. It could not fire. He held that corridor for 4 minutes. He used the broken rifle as a club. When that shattered, he grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it with both hands. He was not stronger than the Velarath. He was not bigger. He was a 24-year-old kid from New Mexico who had joined the Marines because his older brother had been a Marine. He held that corridor because the people behind him could not run, and the thought of stepping aside never once entered his mind. His squad found him when they broke through from a side passage. He was on one knee, bleeding from a dozen cuts, holding the dented remains of the fire extinguisher like a shield. 2 Velarath soldiers were on the ground in front of him. The other 2 had pulled back. Nick looked up at his squad leader and asked very seriously if someone could lend him a gun. Danny brought the ironclad back into the fight after shaking the Velarath detachment with a sudden burst of speed that Pete had somehow convinced the old engines to produce. The frigate was too small to trade blows with warships, so Danny did what the ironclad did best. He flew fast and hit things that mattered. He targeted sensor arrays and communication relays on the Velarath ships, blinding them one by one. Katie coordinated the strikes from her console, picking targets with surgical precision while the ship shook around her. Inside the station, Amy reached the lower levels. The doors to the holding area were sealed. Her demolition specialist blew them open. The 312 humans from Elkridge 7 were inside. They were thin. Some could barely stand. Many had scars that told stories Amy did not want to hear. Alongside them were over 1,000 beings from other species, Selthari, Moravii, Kasani, and others, all of them taken, all of them used, all of them forgotten by a galaxy that had decided they did not matter. Megan Price was standing when the doors blew open. She was thinner than her file photo. Her clothes were torn. But she was on her feet, and she had positioned herself between the Marines and a group of alien children who were huddled behind her. She looked at the armed soldiers in their battered armor, and she did not move. She asked who they were. She asked what they wanted. She said she would not let anyone near those children until she had answers. Amy Dalton, who had just fought her way through a Velarath station, held her gaze for a long moment. Then she held her gaze for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and said the children on the left needed medical attention first. Zorvan tried to escape on a shuttle. Amy caught him. Then the long-range sensors on every human ship began to scream at once. At the edge of the system, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect terrible formation, the Velarath reinforcement fleet arrived. Over 200 warships, the largest concentration of Velarath military power in a generation. The 9 surviving human ships, battered, burned, running low on ammunition and fuel, formed a line between the station and the incoming fleet. Behind them were over 1,300 people who had been rescued from a nightmare. The odds were beyond hopeless. And nobody suggested retreat. Nobody even mentioned it. Danny looked at the fleet on his view screen and then looked at Katie. She shrugged and said she had always thought retirement sounded boring anyway. 207 Velarath warships moved toward Creeth 4 in perfect formation. They advanced the way the Velarath always advanced, with absolute certainty, arranged by rank and class, every ship in its proper place, every officer following the plan without question. From a distance, and the fleet looked like a single living thing, dark and enormous, sliding through space with the slow, deliberate patience of a predator that had never known what it felt like to be prey. The Velarath fleet commander was a veteran officer named Tolvar. He had served the Dominion for over a century. He had fought in campaigns that most species in the galaxy had already forgotten. He looked at the tactical display showing 9 damaged human ships arranged in a thin line in front of the station, and he felt something close to pity. Not for the humans. Pity for lesser creatures was not a Velarath trait, but for the waste of it. These small beings had fought well, in their chaotic and undisciplined way. Now they would be destroyed, and the incident would be recorded as a minor footnote in Velarath military history. He opened a communication channel and offered terms. His voice was deep and unhurried. He told the humans to surrender the station, return the captives, and power down their weapons. In exchange, he would allow them to leave the system alive. By Velarath standards, it was an act of remarkable generosity. They had attacked Velarath territory, killed Velarath soldiers, and destroyed Velarath property. Letting them live was more mercy than they deserved. Danny Cole was the one who answered. Amy was still aboard the station, coordinating the transfer of the wounded and the freed captives onto the human ships. Chris Lawson was running damage assessments. So it fell to Danny, the quiet captain of the smallest ship in the fleet, to speak for all of them. He said no. The word sat in the silence between the two fleets like a stone dropped into still water. Tolvar waited a moment, then asked, with what sounded like genuine confusion, if the human understood the tactical situation. 9 ships against 207. No reinforcements coming. No possibility of victory. And Danny said he understood the situation perfectly. Tolvar studied the human's face on his view screen. He saw a man who was tired, bruised, and clearly aware that he was going to die. He also saw a man who was not going to move. Tolvar had conquered dozens of species in his career. He had seen fear, defiance, rage, and despair. He had never seen whatever this was. It unsettled him in a way he could not quite define. He gave the order to advance. The Velarath fleet surged forward, and the 9 human ships powered up their weapons. On the ironclad, Pete Harris coaxed every last bit of energy from the engines and rerouted it to the forward shields. Katie locked targeting solutions on the nearest Velarath ships, picking the ones whose sensors Danny had blinded during the first battle because they would be slowest to react. On the Defiant, Amy Dalton sprinted to the bridge, still wearing her boarding armor, still carrying her sidearm, and then dropped into her captain's chair with the kind of focused calm that only comes to people who have already accepted the worst and decided to keep going anyway. Then the long-range sensors lit up. At first, Danny thought it was a glitch. The ironclad systems had taken a beating, and strange readings were not unusual at this point. But Katie checked the data twice, and then a third time, and when she looked up from her console, her expression was something Danny had never seen on her face before. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was hope. Contacts were appearing at the edge of the system, ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel, one group at a time. The first to arrive were the Selthari. 3 ships. They were small, old, and barely armed, converted trading vessels with weapons bolted onto their hulls in ways that would have made any proper engineer weep. But they came. And the silver-eyed people who had been scattered and broken by the Velarath 2 centuries ago flew their fragile ships into the shadow of the Dominion fleet, and they took up position alongside the humans. Then the Moravii arrived, 7 ships from the small avian race that had lost 2 colonies to Velarath raids and had been told by the Concord to accept their losses and move on. Their ships were quick and agile, built for speed rather than strength. and they slotted into the formation like birds joining a flock. Then the Kasani came. 5 ships, crewed by a species of quiet, 4-armed engineers who had never fought a war in their history, but who had watched the broadcasts from Elkridge 7 and decided that there were things worth fighting for even if you did not know how to fight. Then the Dorveth, then the Polari, then a dozen other names that most of the galaxy had never bothered to learn. Small fleets, old ships. These crews who had never fired a weapon in anger and who were shaking at their stations but who had come anyway. Lisa Grant had not stopped working after she left the Concord chamber for the last time. She had taken every piece of evidence, the satellite data, the weapon signatures, the chemical analysis, the proof of experiments conducted on living beings from multiple species, and she had sent it everywhere. Not through diplomatic channels, not through official protocols. She had sent it to every species in the Concord, every independent news network, every communication platform she could reach. She had blown every rule of diplomatic conduct to pieces, and she had done it without hesitation because rules that protected the powerful while the powerless suffered were rules that deserved to be broken. The minor species had seen it all. They had seen what the Velarath had done, and they had seen 12 human ships fly into certain death to bring those people home. They had watched a species that the galaxy called weak and primitive and insignificant throw itself against an empire, not for territory, not for resources, not for power, but because there were people in that station who needed help. And one by one, they decided that if the humans could do that, then they could at least show up. 43 ships from 11 species formed up alongside the human fleet, together with the 9 human vessels, and the combined force was still smaller than the Velarath Armada. It was not enough to win a straight fight, but it was no longer a single minor species acting alone. It was a coalition. It was a statement. Tolvar looked at his tactical display and, for the first time in his long career, hesitated. Then the final blow came, and it did not come from a weapon. The Torvan mediator appeared on an open communication channel broadcast across every frequency in the system. The Tall, an ancient insectoid, spoke in the formal tones of the Galactic Concord and announced that the full assembly had reviewed the evidence submitted by Ambassador Lisa Grant. The evidence had been verified. The Concord formally censured the Velarath Dominion for violations of the charter governing the treatment of sentient species. All Velarath diplomatic privileges were suspended pending a full investigation. Then the Drenari representative spoke. The crystalline being, who had once counseled patience, announced that all Velarath financial assets held in conquered space had been frozen. Every trade agreement, every economic partnership, every financial instrument that connected the Velarath Dominion to the wider galactic economy was locked. The elder races had not sent warships, but they had done something that might hurt the Velarath even more. They had stripped them of legitimacy. The Velarath were no longer a respected power acting within their rights. They were criminals, caught and condemned, standing before a galaxy that was finally, belatedly, watching. Tolvar received new orders from the Dominion Council. The message was short. He was told to withdraw. The Council would not risk open war against a united Concord. The incident at Creeth 4 was to be classified as, in their words, a regrettable misunderstanding. Tolvar stared at those words for a long time. Then he gave the order. 207 Velarath warships turned and left the system in silence. On the bridge of the Ironclad, nobody cheered. They were too tired, too hurt, and too aware of what they had lost along the way. Danny sat in his chair and watched the Velarath fleet disappear from his sensors and felt the tension drain out of his body so suddenly that he had to grip the armrest to stay upright. Katie reached over and squeezed his shoulder without saying a word. Down in the engine room, I followed. The captives were returned to followed. The captives were returned to their homes. Megan Price was offered a commendation by Earth Command and turned it down. She asked instead for funding to rebuild the school on Elkridge 7. She said the children had missed enough lessons already. Nick Ortega was promoted to sergeant and immediately requested a transfer back to his old unit because he missed his friends. His request was granted. Pete Harris filed a 16-page formal complaint about the damage to his engines, listing every scratch, dent, and burned-out component in exhaustive detail. Then, without waiting for the requisition forms to be approved, he started fixing everything himself. Katie told him the paperwork would catch up eventually. Pete said the engines could not wait for paperwork. Danny Cole submitted his after-action report. It was 3 pages long, written in plain language, and contained no dramatic descriptions, no heroic flourishes, and no adjectives that were not strictly necessary. Katie read it and told him it was the most boring account of a historic military engagement she had ever seen. Danny said that was the nicest thing she had ever told him. Admiral Brennan met with Lisa Grant on a bench outside Fleet Headquarters on a warm evening. They sat together and watched the sun go down over a city that had no idea how close it had come to losing something important. Lisa asked if he thought the Velarath had learned their lesson. Brennan thought about it for a while. Then he said that the Velarath had learned a lesson, but probably not the one people expected. It was not that humans were strong. Humans were not especially strong. It was not that humans were brave, though they were. The lesson was simpler and stranger than that. Humans did not know how to stay down. You could hit them, burn them, outnumber them, and tell them the math was impossible, and they would stand up anyway. And for some reason that nobody in the galaxy fully understood, that made other people want to stand up too. Lisa smiled at that. It was the first time she had smiled in weeks. Years later, a young alien scholar working in the Concord archives came across an old file while researching the Elkridge 7 incident. It was a document that had been passed down through thousands of years of interstellar civilization, a list of unofficial rules of galactic engagement, accumulated over millennia by species that had risen and fallen across the stars. Rules about territory, about resources, about power, about the nature of war and peace between civilizations. At the very top of the list, older than any other entry, was a single rule. Someone had recently highlighted it and added a short annotation. The annotation read, "Confirmed. The humans proved it." The rule was simple. Never underestimate a species that is willing to die for someone it has never met.